It makes like a being of a TV show.
Hello, everybody. Charles from GMATNinja and GMAT Club here. Welcome to our panel on the thing that a lot of you have been thinking about an awful lot lately, the new GMAT Focus Edition. We've been seeing tons and tons and tons of questions online about it, and we have the perfect panel to answer those questions and anxieties, starting with Manish Dharia. He's the Director of Product Development and Product Marketing at GMAC and has very kindly agreed to be here with us to answer any questions you have. Nobody goes into the break room and has a snack at GMAC without Manish at least knowing about it. So if you have questions, he's going to have answers for you. Panelist number two, Donna Bowman. I'm not saying this to be nice. One of my very favorite admissions consultants from Stratus Admissions have shared dozens and dozens of students over the years. So really thrilled to have her here. Panelist number four, not pictured at the moment, we have Bruce DelMonico. He's Assistant Dean and Director of Admissions at Yale School of Management. Bruce is having some technical issues. He might be back. We have at least an avatar of Bruce. Anyway, hopefully Bruce's internet's going to be working and we'll get him on here. So we're going to jump right in to questions that we're getting all over on GMAT Club about the new GMAT Focus Edition. If you're watching this live, please chime in. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we possibly can. And as threatened, Manish, I'm going to pick on you first. The question that people have been asking nonstop, we've been getting it from our students, been getting it on YouTube, getting it on the internet forums. Why? What inspired this move? Why have you guys made the decisions you have? Why is geometry going away? Why is sentence correction going away? What's this data insights thing? So just help us understand the thinking at GMAC that led us here.
Sure. Absolutely, Charles. And there's a bunch of parts there, so keep me honest if I miss one of them. So I'm not sure if everyone on the call knows, but the GMAT launched in 1954, right? And it's no surprise that the current version of the GMAT and the future version, GMAT Focus Edition, don't look the same as the one that was launched in 1954. And that's because in order for us to really maintain the GMAT as the gold standard, as an indicator of readiness for graduate business programs, we've had to evolve as the market has evolved, right? So not only have the needs of schools, but the needs of individuals who are looking to go to business school, the needs of employers in the business space. So the business community at large has been evolving. And really with GMAT Focus Edition, it's sort of rooted in our conversations across the last 2 years with faculty, with admissions, with recruiters, and even with candidates to business schools around the world. And we've heard a lot about how what makes an individual successful in business today has evolved. And some of the things we heard a lot about is, in order to really do well in the business environment of today, you have to be really good at critical thinking, data analysis, problem solving. And these skills all call for very complex judgments. And so when we started having some of these conversations and learning more about how the needs of the folks that we support have evolved, we wanted to go deeper. And so to learn even more, we launched a very robust research program. We partnered with an outside firm to make sure we were remaining objective. And we talked to business schools from all over the world, various shapes and sizes, just every type of program type that we could think of. We also talked to, via various research tools, business school candidates, potential business school students around the world, over 5,000 of again, various backgrounds and goals and so on. And we collected a mountain of information around what was important in the business community today, what was important to business school candidates, what was important to business schools, and what was going to be important for employers. And so that sort of vast body of research was distilled down into a lot of the changes we made. But again, it comes down to those three critical skill sets: critical thinking, data analysis, and problem solving. And so that allowed us to really start refining and curating the current version of the GMAT to really focus, no pun intended, actually pun intended, sorry, to really focus on what's important for success in today's business environment.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you a logistical question next that we're getting quite a bit. Do we have firm dates? We all know that the new GMAT Focus Edition will be available starting in Q4. Yep. Registrations begin at the end of August. And we know that we'll have the current classic version of the GMAT available until sometime early next year in 2024. Do we have firmer dates on that as far as how long the two tests will both be available?
Yeah, I mean, that's the current information that's available. We are looking to release more specifics, in the coming months. As many know, prep just went live last week, so we're really excited about that. And you'll be able to start registering before the end of August. But stay tuned. Coming very soon will be the official start date of when you can actually take the exam.
Excellent. Thank you. Getting lots of questions, getting tons of them on GMAT Club, getting tons of them on our YouTube channels about data insights in particular. One, for example, from Pooja. Great to see you here, Pooja, by the way. Does data insights comprise logical and verbal questions both? I think what she means by this, I guess, twofold. First, if you could kind of talk a little bit about the questions on data insights. It seems to be data sufficiency plus what we are currently calling integrated reasoning question types. And second, there's a lot of conversation going on about, is data sufficiency changing? Those data sufficiency questions, are they the same ones that we've been seeing on Quant for all these years, or are they a little bit different in some way?
Yeah. All right, great question. So data insights, again, is in response to that feedback we received around the priority that's being placed on data analysis and data literacy. And so we really wanted to carve out a section that allowed us to really get that information around the individual. So data insights, it's, for those that know the current GMAT, it takes the question types that are currently available in integrated reasoning. It pulls in data sufficiency questions from Quant, and it's really recalibrated to focus on understanding the data literacy or the data fluency of an individual. From the perspective of the test taker, it is, again, it's curated from the current GMAT. So all of the questions will look familiar. Have we changed any of the questions? Not really. We've actually just eliminated some. So since we moved data sufficiency into the data insights section, we really just focus. So I don't know, I'm sure this group is very familiar. There's really two types of data sufficiency questions. There's one that focus on kind of, we call them pure, and then there's some that focus on sort of real world scenarios. So the pure ones actually require little more knowledge, or a little more depth of knowledge around mathematics and formulas and so on. Whereas the real world ones don't require as deep a level of math, but really focus on real world scenarios. So we've actually just focused in the data insights section on the ones that are those real ones, and we've pulled out the pure ones. So that's one change, if that's helpful. Was there another question wrapped in there, Charles?
I think that's the big one, because we're getting a ton of questions about data insights in general, and there's some freaking out we're seeing online about, oh, there's this new question types, there's new data sufficiency question types, and I think what you're saying is essentially, no, there's the data sufficiency that will now be part of data insights. It's a subset of the questions that we've been seeing for years now. The ones that are more purely mathematical are going away, and the emphasis is going to be a little bit more on the ones, again, that have existed for a long time, that are more about reasoning and processing information. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Fair? So when you think about GMAT Focus Edition, it's just a curated version of the current GMAT to really focus on those specific skill sets. So from a test taker perspective, again, if you know the questions, the question types, they're not changing. They will look the same.
Excellent. And I want to make sure that we start talking about the other big elephant in the room. We have a question that came up, why the 5-point difference, talking about the score scales. So I think most people watching know classic GMAT, 200, 800, GMAT Focus Edition, 205 to 805. So I guess first question for you, Manish, and then I'm going to start picking on Donna from an admissions perspective. So why that change? And then let's get into how these might be interpreted. And I think that's where we're going to get plenty of questions. So Manish, I guess why the little shift in the score scale?
Yeah, so I mean, that goes a little deeper. So there's a simple answer, right? We want to distinguish the two score scales, the two exams, GMAT, the current GMAT that everyone's familiar with, and GMAT Focus. But it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. It's important to remember that the current score scale was developed for the current exam back in 1997. And since then, the population that really takes the GMAT has significantly globalized. So it wasn't so global back then. And so what we've seen is that the mean has been directly impacted by this, this evolving global test-taking population. We've seen the mean go, up year over year, and so schools have been a little challenged because with that inflated score distribution, it becomes harder to differentiate test takers across that full score range, and in particular, it's been tougher at the top end of that score range. And so we wanted to really target this issue with GMAT Focus. We wanted to bring the scores distribution closer or back to that original bell-shaped curve. And so we recentered the mean a bit, and therefore the scale shifted downward. And so schools will now have a much better ability to distinguish candidates across the full score scale. But because we recalibrated the score scale, and as we talked about a little bit, there are some new test constructs within the exam, it's really not possible to directly compare the scores on the two exams, which is why you've probably seen a lot of guidance out there around really going to those percentiles, which is where we can start looking at relative performance across the two versions of the exams. And until, we're hopeful that this is just because things are new. Once schools become more familiar, they develop their own sort of processes and procedures for interpreting the scores, ultimately we'll see where that shift goes. But right now, the recommendation is to stick with percentiles, and the 5 really is to distinguish and really help everyone recognize that this is a GMAT focus score, not a score from the current GMAT.
Excellent. All right, Donna, finally gonna get in some of the admissions perspective a little bit. For anybody just joining us, Bruce DelMonico, Director of Admissions at Yale, supposed to be with us, having some technical issues. Hopefully he'll be able to pop back in at some point here. Donna, long time in admissions, both sides of it, admissions committee for a number of years, now helping applicants. Here's what we're hearing nonstop from students, GMAT Club, our own students, our tutoring students, what we're seeing on the forums, seeing on YouTube, is wait a minute. We're looking at these score concordance tables and the percentiles and going, well, wait a minute. It looks like a 645 on the GMAT Focus Edition is roughly equivalent to a 700 on the classic GMAT. So the freak out is, well, how do I know that my application is going to be evaluated fairly? If 700 is this threshold, that kind of a psychological threshold that we've kind of lived with for decades in the GMAT world.
Right.
How can we trust that admissions committees are going to really think about them in a different way? And what do you imagine happening in the minds of admissions people as they try to sort through having these two scores that are available for different batches of applicants at the same time?
Right. Well, I think it's going to be a real life, sort of the first couple of years, buckle your seatbelts kind of thing, where people are going to, have to learn to get comfortable with it. But I guess the percentages will help. And really, I think that schools will be tracking it in two buckets and comparing people who took, the new test to those people that are taking the new test and vice versa. So, I think people, if I was an applicant right now and I was going through this process, I mean, there's a lot of appeal to why, this new test is supposed to be friendlier and kind of, get at some of the pain points that people had. So if I was a student, even though, I just wouldn't freak out so much about how the school is going to interpret it, because you can trust that they're going to have the right information to do that. And so you just put your best foot forward. And schools are still looking holistically at applicants, and actually the test piece of it has, I would say, certainly become a little bit more maybe less important in the overall profile because of there's some test optional schools or waivers and things like that. So I think you just have to go in, and if you feel like, this newer option is going to be able to help you, present what you know, and don't be so worried about how, what these numbers, I guess, almost like, get rid of what you thought, and it's hard to get rid of that 700 threshold, but trust that, I mean, in some ways, like the GRE, no one really, unless you're involved in admissions, really knows what those numbers mean, right? But you know that your score is good if your percentage is good.
So question for both of you, really. So Donna, I think you're kind of hinting that over the last few years, you've seen the tests maybe de-emphasized is too strong of a word in MBA admissions. But we've certainly seen a very different landscape emerge kind of during COVID and post-COVID, which is
Right.
Schools are much more open to taking, or far more applicants at the very least are applying with the GRE, LSAT, SAT, executive assessment, GMAT. Now we're going to have 2 different GMAT exams with scores available concurrently pretty soon here. It sounds like what you're suggesting is that you're seeing more flexibility in how schools are interpreting those.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. And I think that when you think about the escalation of change that we've seen, everything we knew about MBA, everything we knew about work has changed drastically in the last 3 years. So I guess this is just, everybody talks about getting comfortable with change and getting, just kind of looking at what the opportunities are for you as a test taker. For example, if you don't like geometry, hey, this is great, right? So there, I think really looking at the details of it and where are you going to be able to perform best relative to other test takers, and don't worry so much about whatever old numbers there were.
And Manish, does this echo what because you speak to a ton of business schools, right? You're not developing this new version of the exam in a vacuum, and we might have Bruce with us. We'll see if this works out. But I'll pick on you first, Manish, while we try to get Bruce on. Is that what you're hearing from business schools as well? Is that they really are putting these tests into perspective, and do they have worries about trying to interpret this multitude of tests or with different scales, or is it not a big worry that you're hearing from admissions committee folks?
Yeah, I can certainly give my perspective. I think Bruce will probably have a better perspective, but I think, schools have, and it's a great point, during the pandemic, they have looked at a variety of different testing options, and they've figured out how to interpret those scores, in the short term as they try to create more flexibility. I'll be, honest with you. We have a large school-facing team that is spending a significant amount of hours, a significant amount of time getting in front of business schools that use the GMAT, one-on-one webinars, conferences, just a host of different opportunities. We are providing all kinds of training videos and training documentation. Obviously, the website has a variety of information. So we are really doing a full court press with business schools so that by the time scores do become available for the GMAT Focus Edition later this year, they're going to be very comfortable with, how to interpret this new score scale and what it means relative to the current version of the GMAT.
So interesting question here. I have not heard anything about this before. There are business schools not accepting the new Focus Edition. Is that something that really either of you have run into yet? I mean, obviously this test isn't available yet, but is that something we're running into for the cycle that's coming up?
Yeah, so the probably the only B school I know about, and is because of the fact that they only have a round 1 and round 2, and they're trying to minimize some confusion.
Harvard.
Yeah, is Harvard. So I haven't heard of any other schools. I think most schools are just sort of still learning, and I think obviously we've talked to a lot of schools through this process, and we have a very large advisory group of business schools from around the world, and all feel very comfortable with this coming change. But I think that's a unique case of because of the design of their their
deadline dates, essentially.
I think that's my sense too, is that just it sounds like it's more they just don't want to have an apples and oranges this year, but I think they're probably going to look at it once it becomes the norm.
Yeah, so. And they are planning to use it for their 2+2 in the spring. So I think it's just an initial, just sort of limiting confusion kind of thing.
Perfect. One of the questions we're getting, again, from Manish, so a couple little technical bits about the test, getting questions about experimental questions. So are there going to be any unscored questions in the GMAT Focus Edition? And I'm not sure you can answer this, but if so, how many?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think everyone knows that we use experimental questions to develop questions for the future. I honestly, that's something that our psychometrics team knows. I don't know that they've even shared it with most of the folks around the team, so I can't speak to much more beyond that. But I think, yeah, that's something that's a part of, I think, most testing programs.
And similarly, we're getting questions about the coordinate geometry on the test. So we're hearing that geometry is eliminated. Is coordinate geometry part of that, or is it just figure geometry that's being removed?
So geometry in general has been removed from both the Quant and Data Insights section, right? Now, there may be certain questions where you could use, geometry to answer it, but it's not necessary. There are alternative ways to answer it. So I don't have specifics around that level of detail with the question that you were asking, but by and large, what we heard from schools is, again, it just doesn't fit into some of those specific areas that they're interested in, and so we've pulled, geometry from the GMAT. But there may be some places where you might say, hey, I can still answer this if I have a knowledge of GMAT, but it's certainly not necessary.
Perfect. Bruce, you're moving.
Grab him while you can.
I'm a real live human.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Bruce exists, again, Director of Admissions, Yale School of Management, and Assistant Dean. Bruce, I'm assuming that you could only hear bits and pieces of the conversation so far. Is that a fair assumption?
I got parts, and I really have to apologize. It's a little past 5 o'clock U.S. Eastern time, and I feel like my computer decided it was time to stop working and take the rest of the day off. But I'm here. I got a good bit of what Manish was saying, and I didn't catch as much of Donna, but hopefully I got some. So I'm hoping to catch up and maybe contribute a little bit.
Perfect. Glad you made it. So now that your computer seems to have kind of shaken off the effects of those happy hour margaritas a little bit and you're here, the big question that we're seeing a ton of online is this whole business of, wait a minute, these score scales are different.
Right.
When we think about that quote unquote magic threshold, which has never been that magical, but certainly plays an outsized role in our psychology as test takers, as people who work, in something adjacent to MBA admissions, that 700 threshold. And now we look at these score conversions and the percentiles and go, whoa, 645 is equivalent to a 700. And the burning question that I've already kind of posed to Donna and to Manish is, how are you going to handle this internally with admissions when you're getting GRE scores? Again, some admissions committees, depending on the exact program, are going to be seeing EA scores. Some will accept LSAT, SAT, whatever.
Right.
But even if we just think about, hey, there's classic GMAT, there's GMAT Focus Edition, and then there's GRE, even if it's just those three, how do you sort through that? And how are you going to manage making those apples to apples comparisons? And how do you avoid that instinct that I'm sure a lot of people have, which is you're comparing numbers and there's sort of this, well, 700 is a good score and something lower than that is less good. How are you thinking about managing all that kind of internally?
Right. No, it's a great question, and it'll be a challenge. I will be honest. We've had to deal with this before with the GRE switch a little while ago, and there've been other transitions, other updates to tests that we've had to incorporate into our review. I know that there's the concordance tables that GMAC has put together that we have access to, which will help. It's a matter of we train our readers every year, so it's a matter of retraining and just staying on top. And we do kind of ongoing training throughout the year to make sure we remain calibrated. So it'll be an effort, but there will be, and we have to think about, we haven't gotten to the point of thinking about what our process will look like, because there will be switching costs involved with mentally going from the 800 scale to the 805 to the GRE and then back again. And so thinking about how to manage those switching costs that will be involved with mentally going from one test to the other. But really, I think as Manish and Don have already focused on, really focusing on the percentile and really making sure that we're really homing in on that as the thing that will help us sort of translate from test to test, whether it's the focus, whether it's the sort of the classic GMAT, or whether it's the GRE or something else for some schools. That will definitely be the key.
Perfect. Related question I'm seeing here from Matthew. If you have a GMAT focus score and original GMAT score, I guess one is a technical question. Do you have to submit both? And maybe that's a question for Manish. And then, so let's start there. And then let's talk about what you should do if you have both and how to think about that. So Manish, what happens with your score report if you have both scores?
Yeah, so, one of the great things, one of the many things we're trying to bring into GMAT Focus is to make things, and I think it was alluded to earlier, just more candidate friendly and more candidate focused. And one of the great new features is that currently, you might have to submit some history with your score report. With GMAT Focus Edition, each individual score stands by itself. So you have to actually you have to actually proactively go in there and submit other score, appointments, so to speak. So it does not, your history does not automatically go with each individual score that you have or each individual attempt that you have on the GMAT Focus Edition. So that's kind of how it's going to work operationally from the score reporting and sending score reports to schools.
Let me go to Bruce next. So let's suppose we have a candidate, especially in these early days when we're still figuring out averages and
Right.
Obviously we're going to have lots of chatter over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years as we figure out how to really compare scores and how to think about them. But let's imagine that Matthew here takes both, and let's pick some numbers out of the sky and say 700 on the classic GMAT, 645 on the new GMAT Focus Edition. The percentiles are going to look at least somewhat different from section to section.
Right.
What would you advise them to do? Is there one you'd prefer to see? Is it easier for you as an admissions committee to just see one? Would you prefer the newer one? Would you prefer to see both?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. We're still developing policy. I think, in every school might be, somewhat different. We tend, at Yale, we tend to want to see all the scores, and I imagine that will continue to be the case, especially going across administrations from the original to the focus, because sometimes the sections can change. We will use the highest total score, but we want to see the context. We want to see the subsections, and maybe one section, even percentiles. One test might have a higher verbal or quant, and that's helpful to know. We also like to know the history, because that helps us just to know, how, to the extent you improve your score, how far you've come. If their scores are, 645, and I think you said 700 and 645, so kind of roughly equivalent. I think we'd still like to see all the information, and it can be helpful for us to have the entire context of your test taking history, as we're evaluating your candidacy, and also things like, if we feel like you might need some additional quantitative preparation to know where you're coming from on that front. So I think that's what we would say. I imagine other schools might be similar, might be different. It also is, I know this has happened in the past with and other evolutions of tests. Looking, we have the concordance tables that GMAC is providing, but we also, sometimes it's helpful for us to know where those, how that relates to applicants to our specific program who've taken both tests. We can do an internal concordance, and that's often useful for us as we're doing our own analyses as well.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I could see that being very helpful. And I was going to say, I think that just sometimes applicants are fearful that, if the schools see all these tests, they're going to think I'm like, they see my bad day or something. But I think in general, and being in this space long enough and hearing admissions people, the way they talk about it, most of the time they're like, that just shows, hey, the person was like, gave it their best shot and that they didn't just do a one and done. So, I think it's okay. And the more information people have, especially in this time of duality, it probably is helpful for schools to see that for themselves, like, this applicant did it this way here and that way here. So maybe to dispel for people to be super stressed about, feeling like they can only take it 2 times and that somehow that's all bad after that. Because I don't think that's generally the case from the school side.
So Donna, oh, sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
No, I was going to just emphasize and reiterate what Donna said. It's definitely the case. Over my time at Yale, it's become more and more common for candidates to have multiple scores. So it's not at all a stigma or a negative to see multiple scores. And so, to the extent that that's a hold up on the candidate's part, I don't think that should be.
Perfect. So Donna, I guess in the world where, because I'm sure we're going to start sending you candidates for admissions consulting over the next couple of years that are going to have 3 attempts at the classic GMAT, 3 attempts at the GMAT focused. You're going to see applicants like that all over the place. So it's basically what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, it's don't be ashamed of those lower scores necessarily.
Right.
If you walked out of the
growth, it shows growth. And this generation, I have to say, has real grit. Like they're just willing to get in there and suffer for for a long time. I think I just think back to, and maybe it was just me, but people, several years ago, it was more like, well, you took the test, you kind of just assumed, that's what it was. And, maybe you took it one more time, but I don't think, I have clients who regularly are taking the thing, 5 times, as many times as you can take it. And, I think sometimes people need to make sure that they've done some significant prep. Otherwise, what's the point just to take it again really quickly? But to make sure, if you've done some extra progress, I don't think you should just take it for fun, every day or anything. But it's okay to take it more. And I think schools, as Bruce was saying, they're getting used to, sometimes some schools take the EA, so they have to get used to how to look at that. Some schools will take old test scores or LSATs or whatever. They, take GRE. So I think the schools are getting pretty good at knowing how to look at scores for the context of what they are, and then look at it holistically, which I think is more and more emphasized, of just looking at the whole piece of it and not just one, like the test scores and everything.
All right, Donna, you brought up the EA. So getting a few questions about that here. I suppose mostly for Manish, what's going to happen with the executive assessment? Is sentence correction going away? Geometry is already not part of the executive assessment. But what about sentence correction?
Yeah, at this point, we are the executive assessment will continue in its current format. I'm sure we are going to continue having conversations with the schools that use it, and executive and professional programs in general. And we'll look to see if that, how that needs to evolve. But at this point, the executive assessment is kind of remaining in its current format.
I have a question that, and maybe the way I understand the new GMAT focus, is it that you just get the one score? And so for schools, I am curious, because schools sometimes do look at the quant, want to look at the quant. And if you do really well on the verbal and your quant is sort of hidden, how does the school see how you are in all of the sections? And maybe I just don't.
Oh yeah, no. So they will get all 4 scores. They will continue to get the total, the verbal, the quant, and the data insights. But what I meant was you wouldn't get any history unless the individual, proactively sent it to you as a school.
Okay.
And you do have a rescaling going on in the individual subsections as well. So the 1 to 51 scale is gone. It's going to be 60 to 90 for each of the 3 data insights, quant and verbal.
Okay.
So, Bruce, Donna, you're going to be looking at a very different batch of numbers that you'll have a different learning curve on how to interpret them for your candidates, but you'll still get all that information.
I think everyone's just going to have the manual with them, like the conversion manual, to kind of, because it takes a while to get used to what those numbers mean. So
about 10 minutes left of the panel. If anybody has questions, please feel free to punch them in. I'll get to as many as I can in our last 10 minutes or so. Interesting question here. This is, and Matthew, thank you so much for all the questions. It's wonderful to see all this, because it's really good for all of us to kind of see what folks are thinking out there. We're seeing a lot of things kind of similar to this, not necessarily specifically about quant necessarily. Data sufficiency, data insights, we're kind of seeing this general anxiety, a little bit of confusion about what exactly is going on here, trying to read the tea leaves in the new prep materials that are out there. So Manish, new test emphasized quant more because the data sufficiency seems to be quant heavier. That sounds like it's not quite the case, Manish, as far as kind of what the design is and the changes have been.
Oh yeah, no. So they will get all, all 4 scores. They will continue to get the total, the verbal, the quant, and the data insights. But
changes have been.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly it's not meant to emphasize quant more. It's really, focused on, I mean, data insights does bring together, in some places, some quant concepts and some verbal concepts. So it's actually brings together a lot of the skill sets. We know that people that have taken the current GMAT and integrated reasoning. So it does bring various things together, but there's no sort of heavier tilt from in the new version of in the Focus Edition.
And getting an interesting question about score scale. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this right, but Manish, moving to a bell curve, I think meaning that what's happened, and tell me if this is incorrect, Manish, what we saw happening with the classic GMAT score scale developed in the 90s, you saw huge changes in the testing pool. It was no longer a nice bell curve. You saw all kinds of funny things, especially in the quant distribution. So now the new test is rescaled in part to make it easier to interpret, make it a little bit closer to a normal, a nice bell curve. So I guess first question for you, Manish, is that characterization fair? And then we can get into the question about whether things are easier.
Yeah, and again, it's closer to a bell curve. It's not going to be a perfect bell curve, but yes.
So then the question here is, can we say it's relatively a bit easier to score since the original exam had very few people scoring near an 800? I guess how would you address that? Because we're going to get those general questions, and we're seeing them online in large quantities now. We're going to get a lot more of them as the release of the test gets closer. Hey, is this easier? Is it harder? And I think all four of us have different ways we're thinking about that. But let's start with you, Manish. How would you respond when somebody says, hey, Manish, did you make this test harder on us?
So it's important to remember that the exam is question adaptive, and it really adapts to your ability level. And so question difficulty will be very close to your ability level. And ultimately, the score is also just a reflection of the population that has taken the exam, before you. So in that sense, as I said, we are, looking to make the score distribution, return it back to that, closer to that original bell curve, remove some of that sort of inflation at the top. But ultimately, this is an adaptive exam, and every individual will see an experience that meets their ability level. Now, there are a few things to remember about GMAT Focus Edition that I think we have been very thoughtful about in terms of reducing test taker anxiety. One of those is implementing the question review and edit feature, which is really going to go a long way to giving people the flexibility to manage their time a little better. So to really so they don't have to sort of gamble on whether they need to spend more or less time on a question. They can just come back to it. And happy to talk more about that. Obviously, you can take the question, the exam in whatever order you prefer. So again, looking to reduce anxiety there. Maybe you prefer to get quant out of the way. So again, there are a number of features with it, and certainly the length is much less, right? So that there's less fatigue in terms of taking the exam. So there are a lot of candidate-friendly features here to really improve the flexibility, to reduce fatigue, to reduce anxiety, and really allow people to focus on just answering the questions.
And I guess to jump in on that a little bit, I mean, I've really appreciate hearing you say that. What we've been saying to candidates is, look, the questions aren't fundamentally changing radically here. Parts are getting rearranged. The test is shorter. You can change up to 3 questions per section. So many of these things are Christmas for test takers as far as the overall experience. And there's nothing new to study for. Sentence correction's gone. Don't have to worry about geometry anymore. Data insights is a repackaging of integrated reasoning and Datasufficiency, things that were there already. So is the test easier? I think you're going to have a more enjoyable experience taking it because it's shorter. But the questions aren't so different. It's going to feel very much the same. And you're compared to other test takers ultimately. That's how the test works. That's what it's there for. So it's not fundamentally such a radically different experience. I guess, Bruce and Donna both, you're going to get this question over and over in various forms. Which version should I take during this period where test takers have the option? And is this new one easier? I guess from your perspective, Bruce, I guess how are you going to be answering that at info sessions?
Yeah, Manish, how should I answer that? It's a good. I mean, I imagine you'd say take them both, right? So, but yeah, I know it's interesting. I think the shorter, I think that was a really excellent summary of kind of the new test versus the old test, and I think at core, it's a shorter test, so hopefully it'll be easier to study for, easier to take, less stressful, less sort of tiring, less draining, and hopefully a better experience, but not fundamentally different. And I think as long as we are, so again, not to sort of be too repetitive, but as long as we're looking at the percentiles and looking across, the test taking pool there should be enough volume, enough data points that there won't be any irregularities or any kind of sort of arbitrage opportunities to take one versus the other and have a better chance. I think there are large enough pools that you're going to get roughly the same performance for either. So at the moment, the advice that I'm giving people is to take the one that you feel you're more comfortable with, whether you want the current version that you've presumably been studying for, or whether you want to wait and take the I guess the more streamlined version that has roughly the same material but just a slightly different ordering and shorter. And some of it might depend too, if you, again, just in terms of timing, if you're looking to apply to a school in the first application round and that's before the focus is available, then do that. If you're going to apply for round 2 and schools are accepting it, which I think my guess is most schools will. There's one outlier so far. I don't know what other schools would do, but then you can sort of wait and take it in Q4 of this year.
And I would say that, one of the things I see, right? I see people when they're like having their meltdowns and they're like, super stressed about all these things. And I think any change that gives the applicant, the test taker, more control over the process. So the idea that you can control when, I know I like math better, I'll do that first, or whatever. I think that's helpful. And generally from what I've been hearing, I think some of the people are like, darn, I wish I could take, like, I don't have to, it's a little bit shorter of an experience. And I don't think that, this sounds like this is the leading edge of group of people that are on this webinar and maybe thinking about these things that a lot of people haven't thought about yet is, what are these numbers going to look like differently? But the quick sort of view that I've had in terms of conversations with people I've been in touch with is just kind of like, oh, that sounds great. It's shorter, don't have to do geometry, and that people are excited to be able to look at that. And I guess I would just say, it looks like, this is one of these things, like change is coming. So, I guess for this particular year, people have a choice, but I would say generally going forward, like look at what's good about it, because you can't change it. So it's going to be, and it does, I think all in all, it looks like it's very positive. And when Bruce and I were just at this, sort of meeting of a lot of admissions consultants and schools, and we had lots of different conversations. We actually had someone from GMAC there, and my interpretation from hearing from a lot of different admissions people at that event was that a lot of schools were pretty excited about it, and were happy, and it was looked at as a positive. And I think we'll get more people. So I'm pretty positive that all of these details will have to be worked out, and it's going to be a learning process. But I wouldn't, I think it's the end goal is to make this to make it better.
And we've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to go quickly through a couple of questions here. BH to Mem, a couple fun questions here. Easier test to prepare and study for, but it's percentile based, so it seems irrelevant. In one sense, sure, is it an advantage for you as a test taker? Not necessarily, but personally, if I were a test taker, I'd be thrilled that I can study less for the test, spend less time in the testing room. It's still a nice thing. You can choose your section order, any order you want. Ton of features, as Manish has mentioned, which is why, and you guys know me, GMAC is not paying me to say this. I think a lot of these changes are wonderful for test takers. Your life is easier. Enjoy it.
Right.
Semi-related question. How do you prep for these? That's a longer story. We're not going to address that in this panel. Don't worry. You know what happens at GMAT Club on the YouTube channel. We're going to have tons and tons of content coming up. Obviously, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do so. There's going to be lots coming up. Don't worry. There's going to be a whole ecosystem of resources available as we get a little bit closer. So don't stress about that yet. One last little technical question for you, Manish, and then we'll wrap this up. Had a question about, actually a couple questions here. One is about sort of the number one, IR section being adaptive, which we're assuming is the case. Now the data insights section will be adaptive on the new GMAT Focus Edition. IR was not adaptive. Very quickly, this came up. I'm a little surprised it didn't come up until the end. Results of one section have an impact on the next section. And what we're hearing that I think is the case is that your starting question on your second and third sections will depend on how you performed on the previous sections. Now, here's the question is, what does that mean? What does that really do? Does that affect your score?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, yes, there is a minor tweak to the starting point on your subsequent sections, and that is really rooted in our desire. So one of the things that's always been great about one of the hallmarks of the GMAT is it's always focused on its quality standards, high reliability, high validity. And so, and our psychometrics team has pushed some leading edge approaches into this exam to really maintain some of those standards while improving the testing experience. And so one of those things we did is we obviously cut a lot of questions from this exam to bring it down to that shorter length. But at the same time, they maintain the high quality standards of the exam so that the exam is still doing what it's supposed to do. So one of the things we did is to make it more efficient, they will use the information, the exam uses the information, except for the first section, but the subsequent sections will use the information to slightly tweak that starting point. We know from the data that there's a positive correlation, across all three sections. People that generally do well on one section generally do well on the other sections. So yeah, it's really just trying to improve the efficiency of the exam. And it's not a drastic change from the mid-level that you see on the first section. The algorithm catches up very quickly. So if maybe that wasn't appropriate, the algorithm catches up very quickly, and so it's not going to impact your score.
All right, that's a great stopping point. Thank you so much, Manish. Manish Dharia, Director of Product Development, Product Marketing, GMAC. Thank you so much for being open with us and coming to this, and we're probably going to drag into more stuff like this. Bruce, thank you for joining us once your computer started behaving itself. Thank you for admitting some of our favorite people to Yale over the years. Donna Bowman, if you are not familiar with her work at Stratus Admissions, please give them a call. I try to ask Donna to reserve some of her spots for my personal students, but if you want to flutter with calls, go for it. She's one of the best in the business, been doing it a long time. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you have more questions on this, don't worry. As we get closer to launch date for GMAT Focus, lots more content around how to think about this. And hopefully we can drag some of these folks back in as some of those questions arise. You got questions, please let us know in the comments and we'll do our best to help. Thank you, everybody, for watching and have fun studying.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.